For one man who was just beginning to emerge on the national political scene, the answer was certain. The Union was perpetual.
He is uneducated, his manners are uncouth, he wants dignity and reserve befitting his station, and has a vile habit of telling dirty stories.
Abraham Lincoln was a far cry from the typical politician of his day. Raised on a farm, Lincoln spent his 20s wandering and working at a series of odd jobs. But he took an early interest in politics, and in order to pursue a political career, he took up the law. After serving several terms in the Illinois state legislature, in 1846, Lincoln was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Over the next few years, his views on slavery would take shape.
He had developed early in his life the belief that when you work hard, you deserve what you get, so it's a fruit of your labor, and kind of the feeling that this is a free labor society, that if you work hard, you get what you deserve.
Following a single term in Congress, Lincoln returned to Springfield, Illinois. There he pursued a successful career as a lawyer. But in 1854, he was drawn back into active politics by the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
He was torn deeply by the passage of this law because to him it upset everything the Founding Fathers had brought together in Philadelphia back in the 1780s. He believed that these Founding Fathers had set forth a series of principles based upon natural rights to the point that somewhere down the line slavery would come to an end. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act had opened the idea of popular sovereignty, which meant theoretically slavery could go anywhere. And to him, that was just, it was blasphemy.
Because the Republican Party was now the vehicle for preventing the expansion of slavery into the territories, Lincoln, in 1855, made the decision to become a Republican, and by 1856 had emerged as the leading Republican in the state of Illinois.
In 1858, Lincoln was nominated by the Illinois State Republican Convention as the Republican candidate for the Senate. His Democratic opponent was the incumbent Senator Stephen Douglas. The speech Lincoln gave upon his acceptance of the nomination was a watershed. He directly challenged the prevailing attitude of political moderates and conservatives that the country's division over slavery could go on indefinitely.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect that it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other.
Stephen A. Douglas is perhaps the most important and famous politician in Illinois at the time, and he has been responsible for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So the House Divided speech is a speech in which Lincoln kind of steps forward as the person who's going to be the point man for opposing Douglas's position on slavery, which is the position of popular sovereignty.
To increase the visibility and momentum of his campaign, Lincoln called his opponent out.
Lincoln was known in certain areas, but certainly not that well known, not as much as Douglas. And so what you do is you challenge a person like Douglas to a series of debates. And of course the debates were focused on a number of issues, but in particular on slavery.
Those of you who believe that the Negro is your equal, of course, will vote for Mr. Lincoln.
I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races, but in the right to eat the bread which his own hand earns. He is my equal, and the equal of Judge Douglas, and the equal of every living man.
At Freeport, Illinois, Lincoln baited a trap for Douglas, arguing that his doctrine of popular sovereignty was illegal in light of the Dred Scott decision.
In that decision in 1857, the Supreme Court said there was no power in the country that could keep slavery out of the territories. Slavery was constitutional, it was in the Constitution, and people had every right to take their slaves into the territories wherever they might be. Well, that is a slap at Douglas's popular sovereignty, because Douglas is arguing the people who live there are the ones that should make the decision. So Lincoln had people urging him to catch Douglas up here, drive him into a corner.
Judge Douglas, can the people of United States territory in any lawful way exclude slavery from its limits prior to the formation of a state constitution?
Douglas had been asked that before. He didn't hesitate whatsoever. He says it didn't matter what the Supreme Court might rule now or in the future. The people in the territories have the right and have the power to keep slavery out of their territories simply by passing unfriendly legislation with respect to slaveholding. They could tax it outrageously so that no slaveholder could afford to have slavery, and there are numbers of ways they can keep it out.
This answer became known as the Freeport Doctrine, and in the South as the Freeport Heresy.
I think this was probably one of the most politically ingenious steps that Lincoln had carried out at this time, because what it did was to force a deep split within the Democratic Party. It forced the Southerners to leave Douglas and the Northerners in the Democratic Party to stay with him, and opened the way to Lincoln's own election.
Stephen Douglas defeated Lincoln to win re-election to the Senate that year, but in the long run, Lincoln had achieved something more important.
And these debates, because Stephen Douglas was the #1 Mr. Democrat in the North, catapulted Lincoln into the national press. And because he made such a good showing against Douglas, debated him on an equal plane, people in Massachusetts, in New York, and elsewhere in the country began to ask, who is this prairie lawyer, Abraham Lincoln, who is challenging Stephen Douglas and holding his own against him?
When several Midwestern papers suggested him as a candidate for the upcoming presidential election, Lincoln demurred, but his popularity was growing, as was his ambition.
The turning point in Lincoln's interest in becoming president is when he is invited to give a speech at the Cooper Union in New York. What's the big deal about giving a speech in New York? The big deal is the leading candidate to become president is William Seward, who is an important New York politician, former governor of New York, now a senator. And so in effect, Lincoln was invited to Seward's backyard to give a talk about the current crisis of the nation. And Lincoln labored over this speech, and it was a huge hit, and it put him on a national map as many people's second choice to be the Republican nominee.
Neither let us be slandered from our duty by false accusations against us, nor frightened from it by menaces of destruction to the government. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it.
The Cooper Union speech was reprinted in the New York papers the next day and received glowing praise from all quarters.
Mr. Lincoln is one of nature's orators, using his rare powers to elucidate and to convince, though their inevitable effect is to delight and electrify as well.
Up to this point, Lincoln had been uncertain whether he would seek the Republican presidential nomination and had little confidence that he could win it if he sought it. But after the reception he received in New York and at other stops in New England, he was encouraged.
I will be entirely frank. The taste is in my mouth a little.